Repeat. We are ambushed. Ambushed. The voice on the comms was shredded by static and the roar of an explosion that shook the world to dust. Status. Give me a goddamn status, Mason, Marcus bellowed, returning fire into a window that was spitting muzzle flashes. Everywhere. They're on the rooftops, second-story windows. It's a classic L-shaped kill box, sir. They were waiting for us. The air was a thick soup of cordite and pulverized concrete. Another RPG screamed past, impacting the building behind them. "Where is the package?" Marcus yelled, his voice a raw nerve. "Wolf, eyes on the package!" A pause, filled with the hammering of machine gun fire. "She's down!" "She's down, thrown by the blast wave. I can't tell if—" "Alex! Get to her!" Marcus cut him off, his command an iron spike in the chaos. "Forget the perimeter, get to the package now!" He keyed the general comms, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. "All stations, this is Bravo 7 Actual. We are compromised. Mission is FUBAR. Keep the asset alive. Whatever it takes." The world fractured into a symphony of concussive noise and razor-sharp dust. One moment, Ingrid was the asset, a civilian analyst being hustled through the skeletal remains of a market square in a city that had forgotten its name. The next, she was collateral, thrown against the pockmarked wall of a bakery by the fist of a detonating RPG. The force stole the air from her lungs, leaving a vacuum filled with the metallic taste of blood and the high-pitched whine of tinnitus. Her vision swam in shades of gray and ochre. Men in advanced combat gear, the SEALs of Bravo 7, moved with a violent, practiced grace around her. They were a whirlwind of shouted commands, muzzle flashes, and controlled aggression. "Package is down! I repeat, package is down!" A voice crackled through the comms, the words distorted by static and adrenaline. To them, she was a parcel, a piece of cargo with a pulse, now damaged in transit. A hand, encased in a tactical glove, grabbed the back of her vest and dragged her behind the relative safety of a collapsed column. The movement sent a bolt of white-hot agony through her left shoulder, a pain so profound it was almost silent. It radiated outwards, a dark star of pure sensation, eclipsing the chaos of the ambush. Yet no scream escaped her lips. Her jaw was clenched, her breath coming in shallow, controlled sips, a discipline etched into her very marrow. She catalogued the injury with a detached, cold clarity. Shrapnel, deep, possibly near the clavicle. Artery intact for now. Mobility compromised. Through the haze of pain, she watched them work. She saw the team's medic, his helmet emblazoned with a red cross, lay down suppressive fire before bounding toward her position. She noted the team leader, a man they called Marcus, directing his men to secure a perimeter, his voice a low growl of authority that cut through the din. Her analyst's mind, the role she had adopted for this life, was cross-referencing their movements with textbook Special Forces doctrine. Efficient, lethal. But they were reacting to a ghost, firing at muzzle flashes from unseen windows and rubble-strewn alleys. The enemy was patient, disciplined, and had chosen this ground with intimate care. It was a classic L-shaped ambush, a meat grinder. The medic, Alex, slid in beside her, his movements economical. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I need to check you for injuries." His voice was calm, a small island of order in the maelstrom. Ingrid gave a short, sharp nod, her gaze flickering past him, scanning the rooftops, a glint of light, a sniper's scope. "Rooftop, 11 o'clock, she rasped, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. Alex paused, his hand hovering over his medical kit. He glanced where she indicated, then keyed his radio. "Marcus, possible sniper, 11 o'clock, third story, red building." A moment later, the heavy thud of a marksman's rifle from their team answered, and a cascade of tiles exploded from the suspected enemy position. He turned back to her, his eyes, visible behind his ballistic glasses, holding a flicker of surprise. Civilians didn't typically call out sniper positions in the middle of a firefight. They screamed. They froze. They didn't lie bleeding in the dirt with the unnerving calm of a seasoned veteran. "All right, let's take a look at that shoulder," he said, pulling out a pair of trauma shears. "This is going to hurt." Ingrid simply stared at him, her gray eyes betraying nothing. As he began to cut away the fabric of her jacket and shirt, she didn't wince. Her breathing remained steady, a practiced rhythmic cadence that seemed to defy the severity of her wound. She was a statue of silent endurance, a puzzle that didn't fit the context of the mission file. She was the package, the analyst, the civilian who spoke 6 languages. But as Alex exposed the mangled flesh and saw the way she had already tried to apply pressure with her own hand, using a precise point to slow the bleeding, he felt the first cold tendril of a shocking realization. This woman was no mere academic. This woman was something else entirely. The retreat was a blur of brutal efficiency. They moved through the city's concrete veins like ghosts, a fluid unit of 6 carrying 1 wounded civilian. The sounds of the firefight receded behind them, replaced by the scuff of boots on gravel, the ragged panting of exertion, and the oppressive silence of a city holding its breath. They found their sanctuary in the belly of a derelict textile factory, a cavern of rusted looms and shattered skylights that offered concealment from the sky and a dozen potential exits. Marcus posted sentries, their rifles carving arcs of vigilance in the gloom, while the rest of the team formed a tight, exhausted knot in the center of the vast floor. This was Alex's domain, now. He guided Ingrid to a relatively clean patch of concrete, away from the glittering shards of glass. "All right, let's make this official," he murmured, more to himself than to her, as he unclipped the heavy trauma pack from his rig. He worked under the focused beam of his headlamp, the circle of light a sterile stage in the surrounding darkness. The makeshift pressure bandage he'd applied in the field was soaked through, a grim testament to the wound's severity. "This is going to be cold," he warned, irrigating the torn flesh with saline solution. The wound was ugly, a crater of muscle and tissue gouged out by a piece of flying metal. He needed to clean it, assess the damage, and pack it before the risk of infection became as dangerous as the men hunting them. Ingrid remained preternaturally still, her head propped up on a discarded roll of fabric. Her eyes were closed now, her face pale but serene, as if she had retreated to some inner fortress where pain could not reach her. Her breathing was the only indicator of her consciousness, the same unnervingly steady rhythm he'd noted before. As Alex worked, his fingers, nimble and sure, probed the edges of the wound. He was a mechanic of the human body, and his job was to understand the damage. But it was the landscape around the injury that gave him pause. His light traced across her skin, revealing a history written in scar tissue. Near her collarbone, a thin white line, almost invisible, bespoke a surgeon's scalpel, not a back-alley medic's needle. Lower, on her ribs, was the unmistakable puckered circle of a healed bullet wound, an entry point. His gaze instinctively followed the likely trajectory to a larger, more ragged scar on her back, just visible as she lay on her side. The exit. They were old wounds, fully healed, but they told a story of violence that her file had conveniently omitted. Alex's brow furrowed. He had read her dossier a dozen times. Ingrid Nielsen, 34, Norwegian national, doctorate from the University of Oslo, civilian contractor specializing in Eurasian dialects, divorced, no children. A photograph of a smiling woman with blonde hair against a backdrop of snowy mountains. There was nothing in those pages, not a single word, to explain the meticulously repaired damage of a gunshot wound or the faint cross-hatching of scars on her forearm that spoke of deflecting a blade. He worked in silence, his mind a maelstrom of contradictions. The military trained its soldiers to recognize threats, and the biggest threat was the unknown. Ingrid was now a walking, breathing unknown. Her stoicism was not the shock-induced numbness of a civilian. It was the practiced endurance of someone intimately familiar with trauma. Her silence was not fear. It was control. As he began to pack the wound with gauze, his knuckles brushed against her side. He felt a different kind of scar, a series of raised ridges beneath her shirt. Curiosity and professional duty, overriding protocol, he gently lifted the hem of her shirt a few inches. More scars. Old burn marks. A long, straight line that could only have come from a deliberate cut. It was a roadmap of past agonies. Each one endured, each one survived. He let the fabric fall, his movements suddenly feeling intrusive. He was a medic, but he was also an intelligence asset in his own right, trained to observe. And his observations were screaming a single, undeniable conclusion. The woman they were risking their lives to save was not the person she claimed to be. He finished dressing the wound, his hands working on autopilot as his brain tried to process the implications. Who was she? A former soldier? An intelligence operative? And why the elaborate deception? He secured the final bandage with tape. "Done," he said quietly. "It's clean. No major arterial damage, but you've lost a lot of blood. You need to rest." Ingrid's eyes opened. They were the color of a winter sea, deep and unreadable. She gave him a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not gratitude. She didn't thank him. She didn't ask questions. She simply accepted his work, pulled a thin jacket tighter around her uninjured shoulder, and closed her eyes again, leaving Alex alone with the silent, alarming truth of her secrets. Pain was an anchor, mooring her to the gritty concrete floor of the factory. But the fever was a tide, relentlessly pulling her consciousness out into a dark, familiar sea. The low, guttural whispers of the SEALS, a language of acronyms and tactical jargon she knew too well, became a distant drone, like the buzz of flies over a carcass. The damp chill seeping into her bones was no longer from the leaking roof of a forgotten factory. It was the biting, high-altitude wind of the Hindu Kush, a cold that clawed its way into the soul. The smell of rust and decay gave way to the sharp, clean scent of pine and frozen rock. She was no longer Ingrid, the linguist. She was Freya, and the weight on her shoulder was not a field dressing, but the cold, reassuring stock of a Macmillan TAC-50. He was there with her. Lars. His face, weathered by sun and wind, broke into a familiar grin, the lines around his eyes crinkling. He passed her a canteen, the water inside so cold it made her teeth ache. "Patience, Freya," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that was always calm, even here, 3,000 meters above a valley crawling with ghosts. The mountain decides when it's time. They were a two-person sniper team, a scalpel poised to excise a high-value target from a known insurgent training camp. For 2 days, they had lived in a nest of rock and camouflage, becoming part of the mountain itself. Lars was her spotter, her mentor. The man who had taught her that the deadliest weapon in a sniper's arsenal was not the rifle, but the stillness within. Then, the target appeared. Not the one they were assigned, but a subordinate, a courier. He was leaving the camp, heading east. Protocol was clear. Observe, report, do not engage. But Ingrid saw an opportunity. The courier was carrying a satchel, and his path would take him across an exposed ridge for exactly 12 seconds. A shot was possible. Difficult, but possible. "I can take him," she had whispered, her eye already pressed against the scope, the world reduced to a magnified circle of crosshairs. "Lars, I have the shot. We cut off the message before it leaves the valley." He had hesitated. She could feel his doubt, a subtle tension in the air between them. "Command said hold," he reminded her softly. "Eyes on the prize only. The prize isn't moving. This one is. It's a clean shot, Lars. Trust me." The arrogance of youth, of believing she was faster, smarter than the enemy. The fatal hubris of the predator. Another pause, then his quiet assent. "Send it." The recoil was a familiar, violent kiss against her shoulder. The world through the scope jumped, then resettled. The courier was gone, a puff of red mist against the gray rock. A perfect shot, a fatal mistake. The crack of her rifle echoed through the valley, a sound wave that pinpointed their location with absolute precision. And from a ridge they hadn't seen, a position they had failed to identify in their reconnaissance, came the reply. Not the chaotic spray of an AK-47, but the single, terrifying crack of a Dragunov. It wasn't a return volley, it was a targeted execution. She didn't hear the bullet that hit Lars. She only saw the result. The look of surprise on his face, his lips parted to say something that never came. He slumped forward, a dark, wet stain blossoming on his chest. His last act was to push her deeper into the nest, his body shielding hers. The mountain had decided. A frantic jolt threw her back into the present. The sound of metal scraping against concrete, one of the SEALs shifting his position, had been the sniper's retort in her dream. Her face was slick with sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was in the factory, the wound in her shoulder a throbbing echo of the guilt that had never left her. Her hand, trembling slightly, moved beneath her jacket, her fingers closing around a small, smooth object in her pocket. It was a piece of metal, worn and cool to the touch. A small, stylized bird of prey, carved from a spent rifle casing. Lars had given it to her after her first confirmed kill. "Every hunter needs a totem, Freya," he'd said, "to remind her what she is." She clutched it tight, the metal biting into her palm. She had tried to bury Freya on that mountain with Lars. She had tried to become Ingrid, a woman of words and data, not bullets and blood. But the past was not a corpse to be buried. It was a ghost, and it had followed her all the way here, into the dark. Time was a currency Marcus was rapidly running out of. Every minute spent in the cavernous, silent factory was another minute for the enemy to tighten their net. He moved to the edge of a shattered window, peering through a high-powered scope at the dead streets below. Nothing. But the absence of movement was more unnerving than a visible threat. It spoke of discipline, of hunters patiently encircling their prey. His mission parameters had been simple. Infiltrate, secure the asset, exfiltrate. Now exfiltration was a pipe dream, and the asset was bleeding on his floor. His gaze fell on Ingrid. She was a pale shape in the gloom, seemingly asleep. To Marcus, she was a problem defined by a single damning word: liability. In his world, Everything was weighed on a scale of risk versus reward. Ingrid Nielsen, the civilian analyst, had been a high-value reward. Ingrid Nielsen, the wounded non-combatant, was a risk that threatened to capsize the entire operation. His training, his experience, his every instinct screamed at him that stationary targets die. He stalked back toward the center of the room, his boots crunching softly on debris. He stopped in front of Alex, who was meticulously cleaning and repacking his medical kit. Status. Marcus's voice was low, clipped, devoid of pleasantry. The bleeding stopped for now, Alex replied, not looking up. I've given her fluids and painkillers. She needs to rest. Another hour, at least, to let the plasma do its work and stave off shock. We don't have an hour, Marcus stated flatly. We have 5 minutes. Get her on her feet. If she can't walk, we carry her. We're moving. Alex finally looked up, his expression hardening. Sir, moving her now could restart the bleeding. Best case, she passes out from the exertion. Worst case, the internal damage is worse than I can see, and the movement kills her. It's an unnecessary risk. The unnecessary risk, Marcus countered, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper of raw intensity, is sitting here waiting for a QRF that isn't coming while the enemy digs in around us. The risk is my men dying to protect a civilian who is slowing us down. She is the mission, Doc. But she is also the anchor tied to our feet. A flicker of something, frustration, defiance, crossed Alex's face. With all due respect, sir, she's not the anchor you think she is. She took a fistful of shrapnel and didn't make a sound. She called out that sniper position before any of us saw it. There's more to her than what was in the file. Marcus straightened up, his patience worn razor-thin. He'd heard Alex's earlier report, and he'd dismissed it as battlefield speculation. He didn't have the luxury of indulging in mysteries. I don't give a damn if she's a psychic, he growled. I care that she's a non-combatant with a hole in her shoulder in the middle of a hot zone. Her file says she's a linguist, and that's what she is until proven otherwise. I am not gambling the lives of my men on a medic's hunch. He pointed a gloved finger at Ingrid. Your job is to keep her alive. My job is to keep everyone alive, and we do that by moving. Get her ready. That is a direct order, petty officer. The rank was a hammer blow, a clear and final demarcation of their roles. Alex held his commander's gaze for a long moment, the argument dying on his lips. He was a SEAL, and SEALs follow orders. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Roger, sir. Marcus turned away, already focused on the next tactical problem, the conversation over. The friction between them was a palpable thing, a crack in the unit's cohesion. Alex watched him go, then took a deep breath, the scent of antiseptic and stale air filling his lungs. He picked up a canteen and a small packet of electrolytes and walked over to where Ingrid lay. She opened her eyes as he approached, as if sensing his presence. They were lucid, watchful. Orders from the top, Alex said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. We're moving out. I need you to drink this, all of it. It's going to be rough. Ingrid simply stared at him for a moment. Then, without a word, she reached out with her good hand, took the canteen, and began to drink. She did not complain. She did not question. She just complied, her face an unreadable mask of quiet resolve. And in her silence, Alex felt a stronger conviction than ever that Marcus was making a grave mistake, not by ordering them to move, but by fundamentally misjudging the woman he saw as nothing more than a burden. Movement was a special kind of hell. They flowed from one piece of cover to the next, a frantic stop-start rhythm dictated by the geometry of urban ruin. Two of the SEALs, their faces grim masks of exertion, had fashioned a makeshift sling to help support Ingrid. Every jostle, every hurried step sent waves of nauseating pain through her shoulder, but she bore it with the same unnerving stoicism, her jaw set, her eyes fixed forward. To Marcus, she was a constant, ticking clock, the embodiment of their vulnerability. He pushed the pace mercilessly, choosing a route that was risky but fast, a path that led through the sunken remains of an old industrial canal. It was Diaz, the team's comms specialist, who raised a gloved hand, calling them to a halt in the shadow of a collapsed bridge. "Got something," he whispered, tapping the side of his helmet. "Enemy chatter." "Strong signal. But it's not the local dialect we were briefed on. It's thick. Slang I don't recognize." He patched the audio through the team's internal comms. A stream of harsh, guttural language filled their earpieces, punctuated by bursts of static. It was alien, indecipherable. Marcus felt a knot of frustration tighten in his gut. They were deaf and blind, surrounded by an enemy whose intentions they couldn't even begin to guess. Then, a low sound from Ingrid, a pained rasp. "Let me hear it." She was leaning heavily against a concrete support pillar, her face slick with a mixture of sweat and grime. Marcus was about to brush her off, to tell her to save her strength, but the focused intensity in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't the look of a curious civilian. It was the look of a professional zeroing in on a problem. Alex's words about her echoed in his mind. There's more to her than what was in the file. Against his better judgment, Marcus gave a sharp nod to Diaz. "Patch her in." External speaker, low volume. Diaz held his radio out, and the strange, abrasive language spilled softly into the confined space. Ingrid closed her eyes, her head tilted as if listening to a piece of complex music. The pain seemed to fall away from her face, replaced by a deep, analytical concentration. The SEALs watched in silence, their own exhaustion forgotten for a moment as they focused on the wounded woman. After a full minute, her eyes snapped open. They were sharp, clear, and alarmingly intelligent. "They're not local militia," she said, her voice strained but steady. "The dialect is Chechen, but a specific variant from the Pankisi Gorge. It's heavily influenced by old Soviet military doctrine." She paused, listening to another burst of chatter. The call signs. Sokol for the leader, Volk for the Overwatch unit. They're not just soldiers, they're hunters. Marcus felt a cold dread snake its way down his spine. This wasn't the disorganized rabble they'd been told to expect. This was something far worse. "What are they saying?" he demanded. Ingrid's gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw the full, unvarnished weight of her expertise. "They're hurting us," she explained, her words precise. "They know we're heading for the old aqueduct south of here. It's the most logical choke point for an extraction. Sokol is ordering his teams to fall back, to let us think we have a clear path." She pointed with her good hand down the canal they were about to enter. They refer to it as the Trough. Volk, the wolf, is their sniper team. They're already in position on the roof of the pumping station overlooking the aqueduct. They're letting us walk into a shooting gallery. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Ingrid's analysis wasn't just translation. It was a complete tactical and cultural deconstruction of the enemy. She hadn't just deciphered their words. She had deciphered their mindset. She had seen the shape of the trap they were all blindly walking toward. Diaz looked from Ingrid to his own gear, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Sir, all I got was a bunch of noise. How could she—" Marcus didn't answer. He looked at Ingrid, truly looked at her, and the image of the fragile civilian liability shattered, replaced by the reality of the ice-cold professional before him. She hadn't just saved them from a bad situation, she had saved them from annihilation. His decision to move, to push her, had nearly led them all to their deaths. It was a humbling, terrifying realization. He keyed his comms, his voice a low, controlled growl, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a newfound respect. "All stations, change of plan. We are not going south. We are backtracking. We're heading for the old city, east. Diaz, find us a new route. Now." He turned back to Ingrid, his expression unreadable. "You," he said, the word carrying a new weight. "You're with me. Up front." He was no longer placing her where she could be protected. He was placing her where she could be utilized. She was no longer the package. She was an asset. The world above vanished. One moment they were in the bruised twilight of the war-torn city. The next, they were swallowed by the earth, descending into a darkness that was absolute. The entrance was a rusted sewer access ladder that groaned in protest under their combined weight. As the heavy manhole cover slid shut above them, it cut off the last sliver of light, plunging them into a realm of stale air, dripping water, and the unnerving echo of their own movements. This was Ingrid's chosen path, a gamble on the city's forgotten bowels over the enemy-held streets. They moved in a single file, guided by the dim, green-tinted world of their night vision goggles. The tunnel was a brick-lined artery, slick with a century of grime. The air was thick with the smells of damp earth, decay, and something acridly chemical. For the first hour, they made good time, relying on their digital compasses and preloaded schematics of the city. But the city below was older and more chaotic than the one above. Tunnels diverged where none were marked. Passages collapsed into impassable walls of rubble, and forks appeared that were absent from any modern map. The breaking point came at a large, circular junction where 5 identical tunnels branched off into the oppressive darkness. Their navigation gear was useless, the GPS signal long gone, and the sheer mass of iron and reinforced concrete overhead was playing havoc with their magnetic compasses. They were officially, profoundly lost. "Dead end!" The point man, a SEAL named Mason, reported back, his voice flat with fatigue. "Tunnel collapsed about 200 meters in." Marcus let out a low curse. He had ceded command on the surface to Ingrid's intelligence, a move that had saved their lives. But down here, in the dark, he had expected his team's technology and training to retake the advantage. Instead, they were blind, adrift in a maze that was actively working against them. The calculated risk had turned into a potential tomb. Morale, already frayed, began to sink. It was then that Ingrid, who had been moving silently in the middle of the formation, spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the tense silence. "I know this place." Every member of the team froze, turning to look at her. Through the green glow of their NODS, she was a spectral figure, pale and injured, yet her posture radiated a strange confidence. "How?" Marcus asked, his tone laced with a mixture of desperation and disbelief. "My mission prep," she explained, taking a slow breath. The effort of the trek was visible on her face. "As the analyst, I was given access to the municipal archives. Most were corrupted, but I found a set of old Soviet survey maps from the 1950s. The city's original utility and storm drain infrastructure. I committed them to memory. She paused. It was a contingency exercise. I build mental models. It's what I do. To the SEALs, it was an explanation that bordered on the superhuman. They trained to memorize routes, entry points, and building layouts for a specific operation. Ingrid was telling them she had memorized the entire subterranean nervous system of a foreign city, just in case. Marcus stared at her for a long, hard second. He had no other cards to play. His men, his technology, his own instincts were failing him. All he had left was the word of a wounded woman whose file was a lie and whose mind was an enigma. "Your point," he said, the words feeling strange in his own mouth. "Mason, you're on her 6. Follow her instructions to the letter." The dynamic of the unit inverted in that moment. Ingrid moved to the front, standing beside Mason. She didn't rely on sight. She closed her eyes for a moment, and the team could almost feel the gears turning in her mind, a complex cartography of memory and sensory input coming to life. "The third tunnel from the right," she said, her voice sure. "It will slope downwards for 100 meters, then level out. The ceiling is low, so watch your heads. We should hear the main water reclamation pipe on our left." They followed, and just as she had said, the tunnel sloped, the ceiling dropped, and the faint, distant rumble of rushing water became audible. She led them on, a quiet, certain guide in the suffocating dark. Her commands were simple, direct. "Fork coming up. We stay right. There's a ladder here that leads to a collapsed street. We bypass it. Smell that? Ozone. It's a ventilation shaft connected to the old subway line. We're close." She wasn't just navigating. She was reading the tunnels, using changes in air pressure, acoustics, and even smell as waypoints to confirm the map in her head. The men of Bravo 7, operators at the absolute peak of their profession, followed in stunned, silent obedience. They were weapons of immense power, but here in the dark, they were lost children, and she was the only one who knew the way home. After what felt like an eternity, she stopped, holding up her good hand. "Here." She pointed to a high wall, where a rusted metal grate was barely visible. Ventilation outflow for the old embassy district. It should be quiet there this time of night. Mason and another SEAL gave each other a look, then worked together to pry the grate loose. A sliver of cool, clean night air, the first they'd felt in hours, floated into the tunnel, a promise of the world above. Ingrid had done it. She hadn't just saved them from a trap. She had led them through the very earth to safety. The sanctuary they found was the wine cellar of a bombed-out embassy. It was cool, dark, and blessedly silent, insulated from the city above by a meter of stone and earth. For the first time in what felt like days, the men of Bravo 7 allowed themselves to relax, their bodies slumping against damp brick walls. Weapons were cleaned, rations were checked, and a heavy, exhausted quiet settled over the team. Marcus had retreated to a corner by himself, a map spread before him, but his gaze was distant. He wasn't just planning their next move. He was reevaluating the entire mission, reevaluating the woman who now sat at its center. Ingrid was leaning against a row of empty wine racks, her face a mask of profound weariness. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the tunnels had evaporated, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion that was bone deep. The pain in her shoulder had returned with a vengeance, a dull, insistent throbbing. Alex approached her quietly, his medical pack in hand. He didn't ask for permission. "Let me see it," he said, his voice soft but firm. She offered no resistance, allowing him to gently cut away the field dressing, which was already showing signs of fresh bleeding from their arduous journey. He worked with a practiced, gentle efficiency, cleaning the wound again under the beam of his headlamp. The cellar was so quiet they could hear the faint hiss of the saline solution as he irrigated the torn tissue. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. It was a silence not of awkwardness, but of shared space, a temporary truce with the world. He was applying a new dressing when he finally broke the quiet. He didn't look at her face, keeping his focus on his work. "You know," he began, his voice a low murmur, "the instructors at BUD/S tell you that every scar has a story. Most of them are lies we tell ourselves to sound tougher than we were." He paused, then shifted slightly, nodding toward a jagged, silvery scar that cut across the back of his own left hand. "This one, for example. Looks impressive. Got it from a piece of shrapnel in Kandahar, right? That's what I tell the new guys." He shook his head slightly. "Truth is, I got it opening a can of peaches with a K-bar knife on my first deployment. Slipped. Almost cut my thumb off. Felt like the stupidest man on the planet." He glanced up at her then, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. It was an offering, not an interrogation, not a demand for information, but a quiet confession. A gesture of trust. He was showing her his own foolishness, his own flawed humanity, making a bridge for her to cross if she chose. He wasn't asking who she was. He was saying, "I know what it's like to carry these marks." Ingrid's expression, for so long a carefully constructed wall of neutrality, softened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something. Surprise, maybe even a ghost of a smile, passed through her eyes. She understood the gesture perfectly. He wasn't trying to pry open her past. He was simply sitting beside her in the dark, acknowledging that they were both survivors of the same brutal trade. She didn't tell him about Afghanistan. She didn't speak Lars's name. She didn't explain the bullet wounds or the knife scars that riddled her body. Instead, her gaze dropped to her own hand, the one that wasn't clutching the small metal bird in her pocket. On her knuckle was a small, pale scar, barely visible. "This one," she said, her voice a near whisper, rough from disuse. "A training exercise, unarmed combat. My opponent was faster. It was a tiny detail, a meaningless anecdote. But in the context of their silence, it was a seismic event. It was a reply, an acknowledgement, an acceptance of his offering." She was confirming, in her own guarded way, that they spoke the same language, the language of controlled violence, of mistakes made, and of the permanent lessons etched into their skin. Alex finished securing the bandage, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second longer than professionally necessary. "There," he said. "That should hold for a while." "Thank you," she replied. 2 simple words, but they were the first she had offered that weren't purely tactical or transactional. A small piece of the fortress around her had just crumbled away. He had treated the wound in her shoulder, but in the quiet dark of the cellar, he had unknowingly begun to tend to the deeper injuries she carried within. Sanctuary had a shelf life. As the hours bled into one another in the timeless dark of the wine cellar, the initial relief of safety began to curdle into the slow, corrosive dread of entrapment. The silence, once a comfort, now felt heavy, amplifying the sound of their own breathing, the growl of hungry stomachs, the frantic ticking of the clock in their heads. Marcus laid their remaining supplies out on an upturned barrel, a grim accounting of their predicament. 3 standard field rations to be split among 7 people. Enough water for 48 hours, if they were disciplined to the point of dehydration. Battery life on their comms gear was critical. Their medical supplies were nearly depleted. They were an island, and the tide was rising. He saw it in the eyes of his men, the tightly coiled tension, the fatigue that went deeper than muscle, the primal fear of being hunted that even years of elite training could never fully extinguish. The breaking point came from Mason, the point man. He was a solid operator, pragmatic and steady under fire, but his nerves were visibly fraying. He approached Marcus, his movements stiff, his gaze carefully avoiding the corner where Ingrid sat with Alex. "Sir," Mason began, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "We need to have a hard conversation about the math." Marcus didn't need him to elaborate. He knew exactly what was coming. "Go on," he said, his own voice dangerously quiet. "We're burning through resources, and we're not moving." Mason continued, forcing the words out. "Every hour we wait, the enemy strengthens their position. We can't stay here, and we can't fight our way out. Not at this pace. Not with—" He trailed off, his jaw working as he searched for the right word. "Not with the drag." There it was, the ugly, pragmatic thought he himself had entertained in the factory, the cold calculus of survival. "You're talking about the asset," Marcus stated, his eyes locking onto Mason's. "I'm talking about our chances," Mason clarified, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "We find a defensible spot, a church, a basement. We leave her with a medical kit, some water, a radio beacon. We move fast, break through the cordon, and call in her position once we're clear. It's the only logical play, sir. It's her or us." The transformation in Marcus was instantaneous and absolute. The weary, calculating commander vanished, replaced by a figure of cold, concentrated fury. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He moved until he was inches from Mason's face, the intensity of his glare a physical force. "Listen to me very carefully," Marcus hissed, the words like chips of ice. "That drag, as you call her, is the only reason we are not all dead right now. That liability kept us out of a kill box that I was personally leading this team into. Her brain navigated us through a pitch-black maze when our multi-million-dollar technology failed. She has done more to keep this team alive in the last 12 hours than any of us." His anger was a shield, but it was also a confession. He was raging against Mason, but he was also raging against the man he had been just a day before, the commander who had seen her as a burden. "She is not a number in your equation, Mason. She is not a piece of gear to be abandoned when it gets heavy. As of right now, she is a member of this team, and we do not ever leave our people behind." He jabbed a finger into Mason's chest for emphasis. "You will afford her the same respect and the same protection you would any other SEAL in this room. Is that understood?" The force of Marcus's command was a shockwave that silenced the entire cellar. Every other team member, who had been pretending not to listen, was now frozen, watching the confrontation. Mason, his face pale, seemed to shrink under the weight of his commander's fury. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Understood, sir." "Good," Marcus breathed, stepping back. The rage receded, leaving behind an unshakable authority. The line had been drawn. The debate was over. He turned his back on Mason, his gaze sweeping over the rest of his men before finally landing on Ingrid. She was watching, her expression as unreadable as ever. Whether she had heard the exchange or simply sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere, he couldn't tell. It didn't matter. The message, to her and to the rest of Bravo 7, was unequivocal. She was not the mission anymore. She was one of them, and they would all get out of this city together, or not at all. She heard the words, though she pretended not to. Marcus's raw, vehement defense of her echoed in the cavernous silence of the cellar. She is part of this team now. The word team struck a chord deep within her, a note that hadn't been played in years. It vibrated through the layers of pain, exhaustion, and carefully constructed anonymity, reaching back to a time when that word was the very axis of her world. A time before she was Ingrid. The damp chill of the cellar floor seemed to deepen, crystallizing into the familiar, biting cold of a Norwegian winter. The smell of dust and old wine vanished, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of pine and frozen air. She was no longer in a cellar in some forgotten corner of the world. She was home, standing on a ridge overlooking a vast, snow-covered training ground miles north of the Arctic Circle. And she was not alone. Here, she was Freya. The name had been given to her by her commanding officer, a wry old bear of a man, for what he called her unholy sight, and almost supernatural to perceive details others missed, to see the hidden patterns in the chaos of a landscape. Beside her, a young recruit named Aelin shivered, though not entirely from the cold. Aelin was good. She was fast, strong, and one of the best marksmen to come through the FSK selection process in years. But she was impatient, a thoroughbred straining at the bit, too reliant on the technology clipped to her rifle. "I see nothing, ma'am," Aelin whispered, her breath fogging in the frigid air. She was scanning the opposing valley with a state-of-the-art thermal scope. "The target squad has vanished. It's like they're ghosts. Ingrid, Freya, didn't even raise her own binoculars. She simply watched the world." "That's because you are looking, Aelin," she said, her voice calm and low. "You are not seeing." "Ma'am?" "Put it down," Freya commanded gently. Aelin hesitated, then lowered the rifle, the high-tech scope suddenly seeming like a useless weight. "Your scope shows you heat and movement," Freya explained, her gaze sweeping across the pristine white landscape. "It cannot show you intent. It cannot show you mistakes. Your eyes, your ears, your instincts, they can." She pointed with a gloved finger. "Look there. By that copse of birch trees, what do you see?" Aelin squinted. "Snow, ma'am." "See again," Freya urged. "The snow on the south side of those trees is disturbed, but not by animal tracks. The pattern is too uniform. It's where they brushed away their entry footprints. Now look up." She gestured to the sky. "One raven, circling. Ravens are scavengers. They are curious. Something new is in their territory, and it's staying still. It has made one of them nervous." Aelin's eyes widened as the pieces began to click into place. "Now," Freya finished, "breathe in. What do you smell besides the cold?" Aelin took a slow, deep breath, concentrating. "Smoke," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Very faint. Wood smoke. A smokeless heating pack," Freya confirmed. "The kind we issue. One of them got cold, got careless for a second. They are dug in just below the ridgeline, inside the birch grove. 3 men. 2 watching this direction, 1 watching their rear." She had deconstructed the enemy's position, not with technology, but with a holistic understanding of the environment. She had read the story the landscape was telling her. This was the lesson she had tried to impart to all her trainees, that the most powerful weapon an operator possesses is a state of heightened, silent awareness. To become a ghost, you must first learn to see them. The memory dissolved, leaving Ingrid back in the oppressive darkness of the cellar. The lesson felt more relevant now than ever. For the past day, she had been silent, observing. She saw the way Marcus carried the weight of command, the way Alex's calm professionalism masked a deep empathy, the way Mason's pragmatism was a shield for his fear. She saw them, not just as soldiers, but as men, each with their own strengths and breaking points. For years, she had believed she needed to kill Freya to survive. The guilt and trauma associated with that name were a burden too heavy to carry into a normal life. She had tried to bury the huntress under layers of academic knowledge and civilian routine. But Marcus was right. Here, in this place of death and desperation, Freya was the one keeping them all alive. And for the first time in a very long time, Ingrid didn't flinch from that truth. She accepted it. The fragile sense of security in the cellar had evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard necessity of action. To stay was to die. Marcus spread their one remaining map on the dusty floor, the feeble beam of his headlamp illuminating the web of streets they had to cross. Diaz, the comms specialist, pointed out a potential route, a series of back alleys and covered breezeways that seemed to offer the most concealment. It was the path of least resistance, a thin thread of hope through a labyrinth of death. The team gathered around, their faces etched with exhaustion and grim determination. As Marcus began to outline the insertion and rally points, Ingrid, who had been listening silently, moved forward into the circle of light. She was still pale, and she favored her wounded shoulder, but the analytical fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. She stared at the map for a long moment, her mind not just seeing streets and buildings, but visualizing sightlines, choke points, and fields of fire. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. Every eye turned to her. Diaz frowned. "It's the best shot we have. Every other route is a death trap." "Exactly," Ingrid countered, her finger tracing their proposed path. "This route is too clean, too logical, too easy." She looked up, her gaze meeting Marcus's. "He's left it open for us on purpose. This entire area," her hand circled a 4-block radius, "is the kill zone. The alleys are just the cattle chute he's using to herd us into the slaughterhouse at the center. That square." She tapped a small, open plaza marked on the map. "The commander we're facing, this so-called, he's not just a soldier. He's arrogant. He proved that when he tried to trap us at the aqueduct. He believes he's smarter than us, and he's toying with us, trying to prove it. He expects us to take the bait because it's the only bait he's offered." A heavy silence fell over the group. She was right. The logic was undeniable. They were rats in a maze, and the enemy was holding the cheese. Mason let out a bitter sigh. "So we're trapped. What other choice do we have?" A strange, almost feral light gleamed in Ingrid's eyes. "We stop acting like prey," she said, "and we become the trap." She knelt, taking over the map. "We walk into his kill zone. We let his scouts see us heading down this path, just as he expects. But we don't go all the way to the square. We stop here." Her finger landed on a derelict 3-story building, a former municipal office that bordered the main alley. "We get there hours before he expects us to. And we prepare a reception." The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. It was one thing to avoid a trap. It was another thing entirely to hijack it. "He will have men on these rooftops," she continued, her words coming faster, the plan crystallizing in her mind. "But he will expect us on the ground. We won't be. We'll be inside this building. We use the debris to fortify the lower floors and funnel them in. We use the cabling from the walls as tripwires, rigged with whatever noisemakers we can find. We turn the second floor into our primary firing position, creating a crossfire that will tear them apart as they enter the alley. She was no longer Ingrid, the quiet analyst. She was Freya, the huntress, the strategist. Her mind a cold, beautiful engine of war. She saw it all. How to turn a collapsed staircase into a deadfall. How to use broken mirrors to watch blind corners. How to turn the enemy's own plan against him with a brutal, elegant simplicity. The SEALs stared at her, a mixture of shock and profound respect on their faces. They were trained for this kind of asymmetric warfare, but her plan was on another level, instinctive, creative, and utterly ruthless. Marcus looked from the map to Ingrid's face, and he saw the woman Lars must have seen. He saw the leader she had been. He felt the gnawing fear that came with any high-risk gamble. But underneath it was a surge of adrenaline, of pure, predatory excitement. They had been on the defensive for too long. A slow, grim smile spread across his lips. "All right, Freya," he said, using the name without realizing its history, only that it felt right. "Let's go set the table." The shift in the team's energy was electric. The air, once thick with despair, now crackled with purpose. They were no longer running. They were no longer hiding. They were moving out with the quiet, deadly intent of predators, following the lead of the wounded woman who had just taught them how to hunt the hunters. The world had shrunk to the confines of the derelict municipal building. Outside, the city was a graveyard, hushed and waiting. Inside, the silence was of a different kind, not empty, but full. It was the silence of held breaths, of fingers resting lightly on triggers, of minds focused with crystalline clarity on the violence to come. Every trap was set. Every field of fire was memorized. Every man was a coiled spring of lethal potential. They had transformed the decaying structure into a perfect instrument of death. Now, all they could do was wait for the performance to begin. Marcus moved through the darkened second floor like a wraith, checking on his men with a quiet nod or a hand signal. They were in position, concealed in nests of rubble and shattered office furniture, their invisible lines of fire crisscrossing the alley below. He found Ingrid in the northwest corner, the position she had chosen for herself. It gave her the most comprehensive view of the kill zone, from the entry point to the pre-planned deadfall at the far end. She wasn't armed with a primary rifle like the others. Instead, she knelt by the shattered window frame, perfectly still, her only equipment a small, high-powered monocular. She was the conductor, and the alley was her orchestra pit. Her job was not to fire the first shot, but to decide when the music would begin. He came to a stop beside her, his own gaze following hers down into the empty, moon-drenched canyon of the street below. For a long time, he just stood there, sharing the vigil. The air was thick with the dust of ages and the electric tang of anticipation. "I was wrong about you," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the silence. Ingrid didn't turn or acknowledge him at first. She remained focused on the street, her posture unchanging. Marcus took a breath, the words coming out with a practiced military bluntness that couldn't hide their sincerity. "Back at the factory, I saw the mission parameters, the wounded civilian, the ticking clock. I saw a problem that needed to be managed. I didn't see the operator. I didn't see the soldier." He paused, the weight of his own failure heavy in his voice. "My way would have gotten us all killed at the aqueduct. My judgment was compromised. I needed to say that." He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was stating a fact, correcting a flawed after-action report in his own mind. It was a matter of professional honor. "This plan," he added, gesturing vaguely at the meticulously prepared ambush around them, "is one of the most brilliant and brutal things I have ever seen. You've given us a fighting chance where we had none." Only then did Ingrid pull back from the window. She turned to look at him, her face a pale oval in the gloom. The unreadable mask was gone. In its place was the stark, weary focus of a commander in the final moments before contact. She considered his words, accepted the apology for what it was, the closing of a circle, the forging of a final, unbreakable link in the chain of command between them. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Her gaze was direct, holding no trace of resentment or triumph. All that was in the past. All that mattered was the future, a future that would be decided in the next few hours, in the street below. "Just get your men out of here alive, Marcus." It was the first time she had used his name. The sound of it, spoken in her low, raspy voice, created a bond that transcended rank and circumstance. It was the language of equals, of two warriors sharing the same immense burden. He nodded back, a pact of mutual respect sealed in the darkness. "We will." As he turned to leave, a new sound drifted on the night air, faint but unmistakable. It was the low, grinding growl of a heavy engine, still distant but growing steadily closer. The waiting was over. The storm was upon them. The low growl of the engine became a menacing rumble, echoing off the canyon walls of the alley. A single headlight cut through the darkness, followed by the hulking, brutalist silhouette of a BTR, its heavy machine gun pointed menacingly forward. Behind it, moving in a practiced, confident wedge formation, came a dozen soldiers, their weapons held at the low ready. They were Sokol's wolves, walking calmly into the den of a far more dangerous predator. From her perch, Ingrid watched them advance. She tracked their progress, her mind a cold calculator measuring distances, angles, and timing. They passed the first tripwire. They moved beyond the point of no return. The BTR came to a halt directly in the center of the kill zone, its engine idling, a steel behemoth waiting to unleash hell. This was the moment. Her thumb pressed the transmit button on her radio twice. Click, click. The world exploded. The first sound was the deafening roar of Mason's M240B machine gun opening up from the third floor, a torrent of lead that shredded the enemy soldiers caught in the open. Simultaneously, from the opposite side, the rest of Bravo 7 unleashed a disciplined, interlocking volley of fire. Muzzle flashes stitched the darkness from a dozen different windows, turning the alley into a vortex of ricocheting bullets and pulverized concrete. The enemy squad, caught in a perfect crossfire, was annihilated in the first 3 seconds. Then came the second stage of Ingrid's plan. A shaped charge, planted earlier at the base of a weakened balcony at the far end of the alley, detonated with a deafening crump. Tons of rock and steel crashed down, completely blocking the enemy's path of retreat and boxing in the BTR. The hunters had become the caged, but they were not broken. The BTR's turret swiveled, and its heavy machine gun erupted with a terrifying, hammering roar, spitting tracers that chewed through the facade of the municipal building, forcing the SEALs to duck back from the windows. The beast was wounded and enraged. This was when Ingrid's dance began. While the SEALs were focused on overwhelming firepower, she was a ghost in the machine. "Alex, window 3, she spoke into her comms, her voice impossibly calm amidst the cacophony. "Suppressive fire on the rooftop, east side. They have a man with an RPG. Alex's rifle cracked, and a distant shout confirmed the kill. She moved from her position, not with the hurried scramble of the other soldiers, but with a fluid, silent grace. As the BTR's gun raked the floor above her, she dropped to a lower window, her suppressed pistol already in her good hand. She didn't spray. She waited. A helmet poked out from behind the wreckage. A single, quiet phut from her pistol, and the helmet vanished. It was the detached precision of a surgeon excising a cancer. The men of Bravo 7 fought with the aggressive, overwhelming fury of a tidal wave. They were masters of violent action. Ingrid fought like the slow, inexorable advance of a glacier. Cold, methodical, unstoppable. Marcus, laying down fire from his position, watched her for a split second. He saw her point out a target for one of his snipers, then, in the next breath, use a shard of mirror to spot an enemy trying to flank their position before dispatching him with 2 perfectly placed rounds to the chest. It wasn't a frenzy. It was work. The BTR remained the linchpin of the enemy's defense, its gunner pinning them down. They couldn't get a clean shot with their remaining anti-armor weapon. "I need that gun silent!" Marcus yelled over the comms. "Working on it," came Ingrid's placid reply. She crawled to a small drainage hole in the floor, a position no one else had even considered. It gave her a worm's eye view of the street. She waited, her breathing slow, her body utterly still. The BTR's gun paused for a half-second to reload. In that infinitesimal window, as the gunner's face moved past the armored vision slit, she fired once. The pistol's report was lost in the din of the battle, but the effect was absolute. The heavy machine gun slumped downwards, silent. The loss of the BTR broke the last of the enemy's will. The few remaining survivors tried to flee, only to be cut down by the disciplined fire of the SEALs. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The roaring violence was replaced by a ringing, deafening silence, punctuated only by the crackle of small fires and the whisper of the wind. The alley below was a charnel house, a testament to the brutal efficiency of their trap. Ingrid rose slowly from her position, a phantom emerging from the smoke, her face pale, her expression revealing nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. The dance was over. The silence that descended upon the alley was heavier and more suffocating than the noise it replaced. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of echoes, the scent of cordite, and the profound finality of death. Adrenaline began its slow, painful retreat from the veins of Bravo 7, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the grim, methodical work of the aftermath. Clearing. Marcus's voice, flat and exhausted, crackled over the comms as his men moved through the building, ensuring no threats remained. Then came the ritual, the one every team leader dreads. "All stations, sound off. Report status. Marcus, good copy. Alex, good copy. Mason, good copy. Wrecker, copy." A pause. "Wolf, copy." The silence stretched, pregnant and terrible. "Diaz?" Marcus repeated, his voice sharper now. "Diaz! Sound off!" Nothing. Alex was already moving, scrambling up a collapsed staircase toward the 3rd floor, where Diaz had held his position. He found him slumped behind a barricade of overturned metal desks, near a gaping, blackened hole in the building's facade. The RPG round, the one Ingrid had warned of, had found its mark. Diaz hadn't been the primary target, but shrapnel observes no allegiances. From her position below, Ingrid saw Alex kneel. She saw the slump of his shoulders, the slow, deliberate way he reached out to close his friend's eyes. The victory, so absolute and brilliant just moments before, turned to cold, gray ash. The scene superimposed itself over another, older image. The sight of Alex kneeling over Diaz blurred, the dusty room dissolving into a windswept mountain pass. It was no longer Diaz's body on the ground. It was Lars's, his blood a stark, dark stain upon the snow. The same ringing silence, the same smell of gunpowder, the same crushing, unbearable weight of a life exchanged for her own. It happens again. The old, insidious voice whispered in her mind. You are the constant. The variable is who dies for you. Her breath hitched, the air catching in her throat like a fishhook. The strength that had carried her through the fight, the cold clarity of Freya, shattered, leaving only the broken, guilt-ridden shell of Ingrid. She stumbled back from the window, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry as the fortress she had rebuilt around her heart crumbled to dust. Before the spiral could pull her completely under, a presence was beside her. Alex. He had returned from the third floor, his face a stony mask of grief, but his eyes were clear, and they were fixed on her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the wild panic in her eyes. He recognized the abyss she was staring into because he had stood at its edge many times himself. He gripped her good arm, his touch firm, grounding. Ingrid, look at me. She couldn't. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, on the memory of Lars's face. Listen to me, he said, his voice low but insistent, cutting through the fog of her trauma. He didn't say the things she expected. He didn't offer the empty comfort that it wasn't her fault. Diaz was covering the Eastern approach, he said, his words measured, clinical. He saw the RPG team take aim. He saw your position was exposed as you moved. He shifted his body to cover you and returned fire. He knew exactly what he was doing. He gave her a gentle shake, forcing her to meet his gaze. That was his choice. He was a SEAL. His entire existence was predicated on a single principle: protecting the man next to him. You were next to him. He made a calculated, professional decision. He did his job. Do not dishonor the meaning of his choice by claiming it as your mistake. The words were a bucket of ice water, shocking her out of the past. His choice. For years, Lars's death had been a weight of her singular, selfish mistake, a burden, a sin to be atoned for. But Alex was reframing it, not as a debt she owed, but as a sacrifice a soldier had willingly made. It wasn't her failure. It was his final, defining act. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not the tears of guilt she had shed for Lars. These were born of a profound, aching sorrow, a grief unburdened by self-loathing. The wave of panic receded, leaving the clean, sharp pain of loss. It still hurt. It would always hurt. But it was a wound, not a poison. She looked past Alex toward the third floor where Diaz lay. She couldn't absolve herself of the pain, but she could accept the truth of the sacrifice. She took a shuddering breath and gave Alex a single, slow nod. She had survived the ambush. Now she would have to survive the peace. The hours that followed the battle were a strange, timeless limbo. The immediate threat was gone, but the danger remained a suffocating presence in the air. Using the surprisingly intact radio from the command BTR, Wrecker, the team's demolitions expert and now reluctant comms specialist, managed to slice through layers of enemy encryption. After an agonizing hour of broadcasting blind, a voice, blessedly American and crackling with static, finally answered their call. Extraction was a go. Rendezvous point was the roof. Time was sunrise. They moved with the slow, deliberate motions of men running on the last fumes of endurance. They brought Diaz with them. his body wrapped respectfully in a canvas tarp. No one spoke. The shared grief was a heavy cloak they all wore, a silent testament to the price of their victory. They set up a defensive perimeter on the rooftop, a flat expanse of tar and gravel overlooking the sleeping, wounded city. And then they waited for the dawn. It came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, delicate bleed of color on the eastern horizon. First, a bruised purple, then streaks of soft gray and pale pink, the light gradually spilling over the jagged silhouette of the skyline. The rising sun touched the plumes of smoke that still drifted from the alley below, turning them into pillars of gold and rose. It was a dawn of breathtaking, heartbreaking beauty, a stark contrast to the ugliness of the night they had just endured. A new sound began to separate itself from the morning breeze, a faint, rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp that grew steadily louder. It was the sound of salvation. Minutes later, two HH-60G Pavehawk helicopters appeared, flying low and fast, their dark shapes stark against the gentle morning sky. The lead helicopter flared for a landing, its rotor wash a hurricane of dust and debris that stung their eyes and tore at their clothes. The side door was open, revealing the calm, professional faces of the pararescue jumpers waiting to receive them. The extraction was a model of military efficiency. The team collapsed their perimeter, moving in a tight, practiced formation. Diaz's body was loaded first, an act of solemn priority. Alex helped Ingrid aboard, his hand steady on her arm as she navigated the lurching cabin. He strapped her into a seat, pulling the harness tight with a reassuring click. One by one, the remaining members of Bravo 7 clambered inside, their faces grim, their movements heavy with the weight of what they were leaving behind. The Pavehawk lifted off, its ascent powerful and immediate. It banked hard, and the city spread out below them like a broken map. Through the open door, Ingrid looked down. She could see the municipal building, a pockmarked husk. She could see the alley, a dark scar littered with the burnt-out husks of vehicles. She could trace their entire desperate journey, the market square where she was wounded, the factory where Alex discovered her secrets, the dark maw of the tunnels that had been their salvation. It was a landscape of her own rebirth, written in fire and blood. She felt no triumph. The relief of survival was a hollow thing, a distant echo that couldn't penetrate the profound emptiness inside her. The fear was gone. The adrenaline was a fading memory, and in their place was a vast, weary clarity. She had come to this city as Ingrid, a woman hiding behind a wall of words and data, desperately trying to silence the ghosts of her past. She was leaving as Freya, a woman who had finally accepted that the ghosts were a part of her. The war wasn't just a place she visited. It was a fundamental component of her soul. Alex, watching her from across the cabin, saw the look on her face. It wasn't the relieved expression of a rescued civilian. It was something else entirely. It was the look of a soldier returning from the front, a quiet, somber acceptance of the violence she had both endured and inflicted. It was the look of a woman who had stared into the darkest parts of herself and had not looked away. The helicopter climbed higher, catching the first direct rays of the sun. The light filled the cabin, illuminating the exhausted, grime-streaked faces of the survivors. Ingrid did not turn away from the window. She kept her eyes fixed on the city, on the smoke and the ruins, until it was nothing more than a brown smudge on the horizon, a memory already beginning to fade. The battle for the city was over, but the war inside her, she now understood, would never truly end. 3 weeks later, the world was a quiet, sterile place. Ingrid sat in a featureless room on a NATO airbase in Ramstein, Germany. The room was painted a placid, institutional beige and smelled faintly of antiseptic. Her shoulder, now home to a fresh, angry-looking scar, a new addition to her collection, ached with the promise of rain. She had been debriefed by a series of polite, humorless men in uniform, her every statement recorded, analyzed, and cross-referenced. She had told them a version of the truth, carefully omitting the ghosts and the memories, editing herself down to a series of tactical observations. The members of Bravo 7 were gone, flown back to their own separate world for their own debriefings. She had shared a final silent nod with Marcus and a quiet handshake with Alex. No promises were made. Their paths had converged in a storm of violence and then diverged again, as is the way of soldiers. She was waiting for a transport plane that would take her back to a quiet life she no longer believed in when the door opened. The man who entered was not in uniform. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored gray suit and carried a thin leather briefcase. He was of indeterminate age, with pale, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. "Ms. Nielsen?" he said, his voice calm and cultured. He did not introduce himself. He sat opposite her at the small metal table, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him. "I trust your recovery is proceeding well." Ingrid said nothing, simply watching him. She had learned long ago that the person who speaks first in a room like this is the one who loses. The man smiled faintly, a gesture that did not reach his eyes. "There is no need for suspicion. This is not a debriefing. It is a recruitment seminar for a very small, very exclusive institution." He leaned forward slightly. "We've read the reports. All of them. The official report from Lieutenant Commander Marcus, which paints you as a civilian analyst with extraordinary courage and an uncanny gift for languages. And we've read the unofficial one, the one pieced together from satellite imagery, recovered enemy comms, and a very detailed psychiatric evaluation of a Chechen commander captured 2 days ago, a man who calls himself Sokol, who now speaks of a blonde ghost that dismantled his entire company." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "The reports are fascinating, but they are incomplete. They speak of Ingrid Nielsen, the linguist. They do not speak of Freya. Forsvarets Special Commando, service record classified, top marksman in her class, expert in unconventional warfare and high-altitude operations. Served 2 tours in Afghanistan until a mission in the Tora Bora region resulted in the death of your spotter, Lars Eriksson, and your subsequent resignation for reasons of personal trauma." Ingrid's blood ran cold. He knew. He knew everything. The name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, uttered so casually in this sterile room. The world is full of messy, complicated problems that cannot be solved by armies or diplomats, the man continued, his tone conversational. These problems require a different kind of tool. They require people who can move through the cracks in the world. People who speak the language of violence as fluently as they speak the language of policy. People who carry a war inside them and have learned to control it. He looked directly at her, his gaze piercing. "You have spent years trying to pretend that war is not a part of you. You tried to bury Freya, but when the time came, she was the one who saved you. She was the one who saved them all. You are not a broken soldier, Ms. Nielsen. You are a finely honed weapon that has been left to rust in a library. We believe that is a terrible waste." He reached down and retrieved a thin, unmarked black file from his briefcase. He slid it across the table. It stopped inches from her hand. "We are not offering you a chance to go back to your old life," he said. We both know that life was a fiction. We are offering you a purpose, a place where your unique talents are not a curse to be hidden, but an asset to be deployed. A home for the ghost. Ingrid looked down at the folder. Her heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. The ache in her shoulder felt distant. The beige room, the quiet life, the attempt to be someone she wasn't. It all felt like a dream she was finally waking from. She had been running for so long. Now, for the first time, someone was offering her a direction to run toward. She raised her eyes from the folder to meet the man's gaze, her face calm, her mind clear. The future was an unknown country, but for the first time since that cold, lonely mountain, she was no longer afraid to look at the map. 6 months later, snow fell in thick, silent curtains, burying the world outside the cabin in a blanket of pristine white. It was a landscape Ingrid knew well, the profound quiet of the Nordic winter, a silence so deep it felt like the earth holding its breath. The small cabin was Spartan, with a fire crackling in the hearth, its light dancing across the simple wooden furniture. She sat by the window, a mug of black coffee warming her hands. With the fingers of her right hand, she traced the contours of the new scar on her left shoulder. It had healed into a puckered, silvery line, no different from the others that mapped her history. It no longer ached. It was simply a part of her now, a comma in a long and violent sentence. On the table beside her lay 2 objects. The first was the small metal bird Lars had carved for her. For years, to touch it was to feel the cold shock of failure, the guilt of a fatal mistake. Now it felt different. Its weight in her palm was no longer a burden, but an anchor. She thought of Lars, and for the first time, she remembered not his death, but the crinkle of his eyes when he smiled. She thought of Diaz, a man she barely knew, who had made a choice in a fraction of a second to shield her. Alex's words from the cellar had been the truest compass. Do not dishonor the meaning of his choice. She finally understood. Sacrifice wasn't a debt to be paid. It was a story to be carried. The second object was a plain black folder, devoid of any markings. It had been delivered a week ago. She hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to. She knew it was a key, a door to a world that had been waiting for her, a world of shadows and whispers, a world for ghosts. For a long time, she had believed peace was a place you could run to, an identity you could build like a fortress. She had tried to be Ingrid, the academic, but the siege had come, and the walls had fallen, and Freya had walked out of the ruins. She knew now that peace was not the absence of war. For people like her, peace was simply knowing which war was worth fighting. Her gaze drifted back to the window, to the endless falling snow. It looked so pure, so final, but she knew that beneath the surface the ground was still hard and frozen, and that life, tenacious and brutal, was waiting to claw its way back in the spring. You could not erase the past. You could only choose to build on top of it. Slowly, deliberately, Ingrid reached out and placed her hand on the black folder. Her fingers were steady. Her face, reflected softly in the dark glass of the window, was calm. The huntress was no longer running. She was simply waiting for the snow to stop,